Hi there, I'm Gabe Freeman. I'm a tabletop role-playing game designer, and I am the creator of Mind on Fire Productions. Through this production company or label, I am producing games. There is one that I've made a video about previously called You Thievin Goblins. This is the latest update to how that is going, including post bunch of playtesting and everything. So the biggest news, I'm pretty sure this is final. I'm removing the early access labels. I am setting a price on it on itch. I will say, just to put it out there, I am a believer in community copies. If you need assistance in order to be able to afford this game, message me. I want to know that it's a real person and not just like bots or whatever scraping data. So please do message me, and I will happily give you a copy or to figure out some other thing. You Thievin Goblins is a game about playing a group of goblins who sneak into somewhere they don't belong to nab a tantalizing treasure. Get in, get out, and don't get got. This is a game that I originally developed as just a whim in a creative haze post the 2024 election in the US, where I was like, I'm just going to make a one-page tabletop role-playing game, should be fast. The initial production, or the initial creation of the design was pretty fast. There was an idea, I got it out pretty quickly. I was able to run it for my parents that Christmas, so it was pretty quick turnaround time there. As an amateur game designer, i.e. someone who is not doing this full time, I have other work that I do that makes the money. That has meant that I've had limited time to work on this over the last year, but I have still sunk a good amount of time into it. As one of my friends, Sabrina Hawthorne, who is also a game designer, please check out her work, has said that I've spent more time on this one-page RPG than she has ever spent on a one-page thing. That's my own perfectionist tendencies, I guess, coming out. In the last video that I made, I talked about some of my basic ideas around design decisions and everything. This video, we're talking about the playtests that I ran post that video being released, the insights that came out of it, and the new design from there. So first, I had already planned on doing playtesting when I produced that last video back in, I want to say October, maybe September, and very quickly got really shockingly positive responses to it, including from another fellow YouTuber, Trekeros, or Trek, who is I will probably call him for the rest of this. Trek is also a tabletop role-playing game designer, makes a ton of content, a lot about like homebrew for D&D and stuff like that. Very smart, very good design, mathematically minded, very cool stuff. Check out that YouTube channel as well. Trek commented, and within a week had translated my design at the time into French and run it with his local group in France, of people who like run games for like a game night, public game night, which was shocking. I was not expecting that at all. I ended up getting to talk to Trek for, gosh, I think like over an hour about how that playtest went and what the experience was like GMing it, as well as what it seemed like the player's experience was. Obviously, it's not how I usually run a playtest, but it was still incredibly useful feedback. I then was able to gather two groups, one remotely and one in person, of friends to play this as well. The group in person was run by my friend Sabrina, and because because so much of the design of this is focused on helping a GM run this with as little prep as possible, the goal was I don't want to be the one running it, if that makes sense. It's not a test if I'm the one doing it so much. And then I also had another friend of mine run a virtual one with some of her friends as well as some of our mutual friends and got to observe that. The end result of all of this playtesting is a ton of insights, as always. And as a professional user experience researcher, I probably have a more figured out way of doing this than the average game designer does. But in this case, I ended up making a spreadsheet of every insight as I was running through it. But first, I'll start with the playtest notes. So this right here is how I was taking notes during the playtesting sessions. You can see my notes that are, a lot of them are just straight up like, what happened? What did they say? Trying to attribute to whoever said something so that I could theoretically like pull the line through of like one player's experience. And then, so I was really just going down this column as I was taking notes, and then going through it, I added these other columns of data around it of first, which playtest are we even talking about? What was the area that we were talking about, such as learning the rules or layout, etc. Game section is just the sections of the document that I was working, and then subsections is so you got like doing stuff, and then also this related in this case to the antagonist track, and then valence is just emotional response. Very negative reaction, some negative reaction, neutral, some positive, very positive. That's all that, and then my own commentary as opposed to the thing that happened is in this column. So you can see sometimes it's sparse, sometimes I just skipped it because I am doing this by myself for myself. It doesn't need to be legible to another human being, except for obviously right now. And anyway, I ended up checking this box for like points that I thought were really really important and I wanted to come back to. From there, I ended up like taking those insights and writing them out. Here, I apologize for the difficulty of reading this with this like green mark for indicating that I've checked it off. But here, actually, I'll use this as an example. Size would be like, actually, I should use one that actually has content on it. So this is like the size of making this action. This is priority from like 0 to 2 or 3. I can't remember what I ended up doing. Which playtest the insight was mentioned in. In this case, it was mentioned in all 3. Topic area, game section, hub section. The actual insight, in this case, many instances with PCs ending the game with the same items they started with. Something that I hadn't expected and didn't intend. And then what I wanted to do about it, or in this case, a bunch of questions related to like how I might react to it. So with that being said, I then implemented all of these changes. I was keeping track of it in a Google Doc. That's where I had been writing the document anyway, and then I would import it into InDesign, which is where I was doing like proper layout. But I was keeping track of the changes in like a suggested edits kind of fashion, and at a certain point, realized that hopefully you can see this. I had 221 changes made to this document. So I felt it's interesting because everyone enjoyed the game. There was a lot of really, really positive feedback. And people enjoyed themselves. They enjoyed being weird little guys. And they enjoyed some of the specific mechanics. There were also some problems that arose, especially in the GMing section, but also in relation to like kind of a little like overly complicated rules around like durability. A thing that is like just so obvious in retrospect of like I had people making their goblins, and one of the first things you do is pick a what I called at the time a small treasure that you have found, which could be like a pot with no handle or something like that. That is like a piece of trash that your goblin calls a small treasure. And many players, in the grand scheme of things, like across playtest, it was only maybe 2 per or 1 to 2 per, but still that percentage adds up when we're talking about groups of like 6. And it was a through line that kept happening with someone would become overly attached to their item, overly attached in the sense of I didn't want them to be attached to it, would use that item as like a core part of their character's personality. And that goes completely against my goal of having them picking up random trash, smashing it together, breaking it, and moving forward in that way, which was like actually one of my players in the online game is the one who really like put a finger directly on like I think the core loop is this, and I was like, yes, you're right. That is what I'm trying to get you to do. Um, and so there was a little bit of configuring of like, man, okay, so that's not working right now. How do I adjust the design or make it clearer also to the players that like, no, it's trash. You don't care about it. You like the incentive should be to be breaking stuff constantly. And so, bunch of changes made there. There were also a bunch of interesting things on the GM side of these. I was creating tools for GMs. Some of the GMs were very experienced. Trek is an RPG YouTuber for the last many years, obviously experienced GM. Sabrina is also a game designer and an experienced GM. My friend who ran the online game, who I'm struggling right now to remember if she gave permission to use her name, so that's why I'm not doing it, is a medium experienced GM, like a couple years, of like periodic games. And so I had a little bit of a division there of like what people needed, but the results were really interesting. They were basically the same. Each person was talking about how it felt like the tools were constraining them. That something would happen in the game where they would just break down in some fashion. In the online game, I had these rules around like, okay, it's a heist, and like, how aware are the enemies of you? Where it goes from like completely oblivious and confident to like very aware of what's happening and getting more and more frustrated. And in the online playtest, the first thing the players did was just knock on the front door. And so that idea of like, oh, they're not like they're supposed to continue to be unaware of this seems crazy in that case. Like it just completely broke. And that was really, really useful insight for me to be like, okay, I need this to be flexible. Guidelines can still be useful, but that doesn't mean, but they can't be keeping someone from being able to do what they need to do in the moment. So, with that being said, for someone who is not as, like, hasn't been as deep into this document as I am, some of the, like, most of the changes are probably not going to be apparent, especially in terms of, like, there's some stuff where it'd be just visually very obvious, like, oh, this image was not here before, and like these were basically switched on this page. Do stuff was on the left hand column, make your goblin was this and this. Otherwise, who knows? It would probably just seem like nothing very much has changed. Uh, but when you're working with 2 pages worth of text, small changes can have really big impacts. So one of the big things, just working on that problem I mentioned of like, oh, goblins are getting attached, or sorry, players are getting attached to specific items. The first thing I did, changing the name small treasures to trifles. Trifles to really indicate like treasure is like something you keep around, right? Like it is valuable. That's what the word means. Trifles are deliberately a term that means it's not that valuable. And then I include this new line, goblins want what they don't have and discard what they already do. So if it's not already clear, the first line is saying, you don't care about this stuff. Here's the rules for how it works when you have one. You start with one. Here's some examples. And I also added this line because it was so funny when it was in a playtest, because one of the GMs in the online playtest had asked the players this of like, how big is the item compared to you? And that led everybody to coming up with this much more varied idea of like, oh, how big is my guy? Uh, oh, he's like small enough to fit into like a small pot or whatever. Is like, it just really puts that image in the head. And I was like, I'm stealing that. That's going to become a real thing here. Something that hasn't ended up in the game that I'm curious. I think is I'm going to end up doing a GM and a player cheat sheet slash character sheet in case of the players. And one of the big things that I want to do is like really encourage players to draw their goblins, because a bunch of people did it on their own volition, and it was delightful both to see the images and people were sharing them, and it was great. But space is limited, so that didn't end up happening here. Actually, pretty substantially changed the core system of how you do stuff. So now there's this entire section here. So we start with, okay, what outcomes are you hoping for? What happens if you fail? So a PC is setting this up. This was one of many changes that were involved in trying to make, to take the weight off of the GM as much as possible. And instead bringing it to like the hive mind of the players, making this a much more collaborative game than it might initially appear. It's like, visually, You Thievin Goblins, there's a little bit of like goofy D&D kind of vibes in this. And here I'm explicitly bringing in more of that like story gaming roots of, you were the player. I want you to tell me not only what outcome you're hoping for, but what happens if you fail. And then the GM is just deciding the mechanical part of that of, okay, how hard is it? I came up with some couple like fun difficulty levels. And then once you have the treasure, goal was the original term. Now that treasure is not attached to small treasures, I can bring that term back in for what they're actually heisting, which was the reason why it wasn't the title originally way back when. This part is basically the same. I do now have more explicit rules for if you're rolling 0 dice, and also dice now explode. This is something that like I listened actually to the Dice Exploder podcast's episode on exploding dice and was like, oh yeah, obviously, like these are goblins. This is when dice should explode because it adds that chaos. It doesn't actually change. Tip for everybody viewing this, having dice explode does not drastically change the statistics of results, but it really changes the feel of them. So that, which is also mentioned in the Dice Exploder episode, I highly recommend it. So check that out. But exploding dice. Now we've got results. This was a really last minute change actually. Changing what values on a die count as success. Originally it was a 5 and a 6 and that was it. And as I was like trying to tweak how this felt, there's a lot more ways to lose dice now, but it was too difficult, right? Like I wanted one success to be relatively easy to get, and it was so hard. Like if you had 3 dice, you were still so unlikely. I did the math somewhere else, but yeah, it was still really, really unlikely. And so going back to actually a more standard way of having dice successes work for like your die pool mechanics, your Vampire the Masquerades, etc., is much more of this like binary, like half, and then something happens on the like 1s and 6s or 1s and 10s in the case of that game. So hopefully a little bit easier for players to like grok if they're coming from another game, but also really increasing the odds and making it also a lot easier to intuitively understand. Humans are bad at statistics. It's just, and figuring out probabilities. I am too. So that was where that came from. So we've got now, instead of like what is the highest die you have, and if it's a five, then something, or it's a six and something. Now we're talking about dice that succeeded versus didn't succeed. So maybe it takes a little bit longer, but not much, and ended up having a nicer feel to it from what I've seen so far. I've also updated, so now if you get two less or worse, so two less successes than what you needed, you fail, and bad consequences can happen. If you get a one or just one less, it is a fail, but what's the opening? And again, prompting the PC to figure out what that opening is, not the GM. So equal, it's a success, but consequences, and then more than needed, we go goblin mode. And so this is a term that, and some of the results come from the previous version, but there's a couple bits of language. Again, make this a big deal, right? Like adding this line of acted out in goofy slow motion. I'm going to actually scroll so that it's not behind my head. But yeah, goblin mode, acted out in goofy slow motion, and then choose A, B, or C. So, and then you repeat with -1 success until you get to equal. Hopefully this language is understandable enough to other people, but yeah, we'll see what happens. So you get to store a die, you gain a title, which that was another thing, is just like everybody wanted titles, and in two of the games, like in one game, nobody got a title. In another game, only one person got a title, and then in a third, a couple people got them. And that was not the intention. I don't know why, like statistically, I don't know fully why that happened, but for stats nerds, please let me know and check it out. But hopefully this is now a little bit easier to get. Actually, in Track's playtest, one of the things he mentioned was, oh, the thing I personally was the most excited about was goblins getting titles. That was the thing that drew me to this game. And then it didn't happen in his game. And so I was like, oh wait, that's like, that's not ideal. Sometimes it is just luck, of course, but seeing if we can bump that up a little bit. Breaking stuff has drastically changed. This is and so has combining stuff. In the previous version of this, you combined, and that made the object more durable. And you could spend the durability of an object to add a dice, but it was not leading to the kind of play that I was looking for. Again, it was like, oh well, if you want, like, the more stuff you get, the less likely it is to break. Like, you can spend it, but you don't have to, and there was a lot less risk of it breaking. Now, rather than combining items making it more durable, it makes it more powerful. The benefit to your doing stuff, you get more dice. And then if you break it, it can break automatically if you roll 2 or more ones, which, if you're rolling more dice, is also more likely. So benefit of like this system is that, like, as the goblins get more and more chaotic, more powerful, their stuff is breaking more often and also is bigger, so that it's adding more chaotic sense to the experience. And then you can also choose to break it in order to get more dice. So big changes there. Also, I hope way easier to understand, instead of like having like little checkboxes of durability, which I was never happy with. Making some changes there that I hope fit into the design intention better. One of the things that was mentioned as being really useful about the scenes was helping them understand how long the game was going to be. Understanding a little bit of like, okay, I should aim for this roughly, and like having that in the back of their mind. However, I had a system of PC phase, then GM phase, and PC phase, and that just completely fell apart. Most of the players, I think, were coming from D&D, and therefore were much more used to being like, I do X, and then the GM being like, roll, and then a result, and that's it. And I was trying to do more of like a story game kind of vibe with how the scene was structured, and it just wasn't working. Like it wasn't it. While I think those mechanics could be used in a different game, this isn't that game, and so they're gone. Leaning into what the players were naturally wanting to do anyway. Now, there's still advice on if nothing risky is keeping them from their goal, just go to the next one. It's fine. We've, still got some advice on like what a scene should look like, but it's a lot less specific, prescribed, that kind of thing. Tension. This was a suggestion by one of the players in the online game that I thought was just so smart, even if it was something that would be kind of difficult in an online game, but marking tension in a really tangible way. So, beans in a jar. Actually, I think the GM of the online game is the one who suggested this and brought up that, like, for those who are aware, Dimension 20 is a live action role playing comedy show. And in one of their seasons, that came out relatively recently, for those who care, Fantasy High Junior Year, there's like a way to kind of like overclock yourself in like trying to do too many things at once, where you could stress yourself out and then you would get these like little red tokens. It freaked the players out to just have them. And I do think that there is something just so beautiful about like having a tangible physical object that like is just there. The problem with tension before was how much it wasn't a thing that the players really thought about or interacted with. So like when suddenly the goblin manager was like, "Oh yeah, I've been building up all of this pool of stuff, and now a bad thing happens," it felt kind of random and like there wasn't anything they could do about it. Even if they could, it just felt too distant. Now, with it being a physical, like a jar of beans, as I'm suggesting here, or whatever else you want to use to just be like physically visible, um, even if they don't actually have more or less power to affect it, they are thinking about it. They know what's going on, and in a similar way to like in the game Dread or Starcrossed, where there's the Jenga tower, and like you can see it becoming more and more unstable. You can see how much tension there is. Keeping track of this was also a little bit difficult for GMs, of trying to remember. Oh yeah, I had it to like you added another tension. Like you normally add one tension per scene, and then after they have gotten to their goal, they add two tension per scene. Nobody remembered to do that across the three playtests, and as was very pointed out, like GMs always have the most going on mentally, so let's reduce it. You don't need to think about that. You still need attention every scene, but the players are going to have a harder time doing stuff once they have the treasure. Okay, so blah 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 blah. All of this, hopefully easier to understand. And another thing that was mentioned, that this final one, the "It's over, all goblins captured, game over," which that's all the same text as before, was scary. The GMs didn't want to do it because they were like, "Well, that sucks." um, I don't want the like. It feels like they couldn't do anything about it, or the players couldn't do anything about it, and it would just kind of happen. Now, instead, there is this line: "Unless the PCs do something about it," and hopefully they'll also remember that they can escape the consequences. So, I think that covers the most of this. There's a bunch of like small changes throughout this that like I'm not going into. This is long enough. The whole idea here, I wanted to just show like, you know, hopefully if you watched the other video, you're like, wow, this guy's so smart and did such interesting design work. And I made a bunch of mistakes that I didn't even realize. You can only learn through playtesting because you are too close to it. Like you're here with the document, and the someone else needs to look at it who hasn't been who doesn't have every past version of each mechanic in their head as they're trying to parse this, who has other games and stuff that they've been thinking about more, and they will always discover things that you can't. Now, you should also playtest by yourself, of just trying things out, doing the roles for it for both sides in a GM player kind of game like this. And you can learn a lot doing that. I did. But at some point, you got to get out there and like have someone else play. That's really like, I will, I'm planning on doing a bigger video on playtesting specifically as like someone with experience in the professional world doing that kind of thing, but does this amateurly in the sense that like I'm not doing it professionally. But here, the thing is, you will hear from other designers that like the big names that you should always be playtesting, just constantly. And theoretically, I agree with that. However, in practice, getting a group together is really hard. And if you are doing this not as your job, that might be an evening that you don't get to like play. And instead, you're like much more mentally taxed because you have to run this whole thing. So, with that being said, I think that the general advice I would provide from my own limited experience is that you should playtest when you don't know what to do next, whenever that happens, however often that happens, because your own momentum is really important in designing a game when you're not doing it professionally, like which I think the vast majority of people who make stuff in this space are doing. So do what you can by yourself, because sometimes you can just sneak it in at like right before you go to bed. You're not going to run a playtest then. Sometimes, I go to a writing group on like Sunday mornings, and I can write there. I can't test with anybody there because the other people are working too, right?
Hello, this is Feature Game from January 25th, 2026. So I ended up running a playtest over the holidays with my parents, who are very delightful people who were willing to try to be goblins. And in fact, I was able to convince my dad to GM and have my mom and I be playing. And there were some insights, of course, that came out of it. Well, it wasn't intended to be a playtest. It was intended to just be, hey, let's play this game I made. And then, of course, insights come out of it. So, what are you going to do? In this case, I wanted to go over just like a very brief, why does the document now look different from the one that I showed earlier in this video? So, let's go through it. I've already filtered this out to just be the ones that my parent playtests had included. My parents being far less familiar with tabletop role playing games than the people that most of the playtests were with, had questions that no one else had about, like, wait, what does this word mean? Um, there's also, we caught some uh, silly things, like I still had the title combining items instead of combining titles, and stuff like that. But most of this is just little things, clarifying rules, little wording things. The one thing that came up in this playtest again that I really want to mention and that I have not yet had time to do, basically like a placemat for players and GMs. The player one might end up being like to print it out like 6 to a sheet of paper or something because it's a lot less complicated. On the other hand, having a copy of the rules is like in a player focused, like post creation way. Not a terrible idea. Haven't done it yet. Thought about it a good amount, but that seems like a potentially useful way to expand on this 2-page document while still kind of call it that. Thank you for getting to the end of the video. I really appreciate it. Top for now is Gabe Freeman for My Natural Productions.